Good evening and thanks for joining us. Ukraine is teetering between diplomacy and military might tonight. For the first time, Western and Russian diplomats met face to face. There was no breakthrough, but there is at least some hope. On the ground in Crimea, though, it is still tense. A UN special envoy had to flee for his life today, and the Pentagon is sending fighter jets to boost NATO's presence in the region. Tom Clark begins our coverage in Kiev tonight. Tom?
Thanks, Donna. Well, there is a belief here that Russia is desperately trying to provoke an incident to provide a pretext for an invasion. And tonight may have been one of those attempts. The United Nations Special Representative, Robert Seri, was in Crimea today. His car was stopped by uniformed and armed men who told him to leave Crimea immediately. Well, Seri fled to a nearby coffee shop, which was then surrounded by a mob who barred the doors, preventing anyone from leaving. Outside, they marched and chanted, "Crimea belongs to Russia." Finally, local police helped clear a path, and Seri is reported to have been headed for the airport. Global's Paul Johnson is once again in Crimea tonight. Paul, is there any word yet as to Seri's whereabouts and his safety?
Tom, he's safe. While he was threatened, he wasn't hurt. They ended up going to the airport pretty quickly, and he has since flown out of the country. But this really speaks to the tense situation all across the Crimean Peninsula as Russia continues to consolidate its power. There are still a number of Ukrainian military bases where there's a standoff between Russians who've surrounded the bases and the Ukrainians inside, and then a couple of other bases where the Ukrainians appear to have surrendered.
You're looking at the result of Russia's steady, systematic takedown of Ukrainian institutions on the Crimean Peninsula. In the background, you have pro-Moscow demonstrators. And now, inside this fence, you have heavily armed Russians on patrol.
We're inside a Ukrainian military facility where there's quite a remarkable situation happening here. Right now, there are both Russian and Ukrainian soldiers here. The Ukrainians tell us that both sides are now jointly in control of this facility. They're not saying they've surrendered, but the Russians are the only ones who have weapons right now, and the Ukrainians appear to have been disarmed.
After days of a tense standoff, the Russian takeover of this Ukrainian air defense base happened last night when the outnumbered and outgunned Ukrainian forces finally let the Russians in without a shot fired. In this footage, shot by the wife of a Ukrainian soldier, you can clearly make out the Russian military license plate on one of the trucks. And this soldier shows up with a Russian flag still on his shoulder, despite Vladimir Putin's insistence that these are not Russian soldiers. Well, it's still confusing as to exactly who is in charge here. Ukrainian officers on the base today tell us that everything is peaceful after the deal they struck with the Russians, which sees them in apparent control of the base's weapons. But Ukrainians still at their posts and not apparently having been forced into an official surrender.
And some other important developments tonight. The Pentagon has announced that the United States is going to be moving a number of F-15 fighter planes from the UK to Lithuania because of this crisis. They're also going to be sending some assets into Poland. And a Turkish newspaper today is reporting that the Turkish government has granted permission to the U.S. Navy to allow one of its warships to transit the Bosphorus Strait. That's the only way that you can move from the Mediterranean into the Black Sea. We don't yet know what kind of a warship it is, but we know it's due to move within the next couple of days. Tom?
Okay, thanks, Paul. Global's Paul Johnson in Crimea tonight. Well, as military options continue to ramp up, the search for a diplomatic solution is becoming intense. The American and Russian foreign ministers met with their European counterparts in Paris today. One key objective was to convince the Russian minister, Sergei Lavrov, to meet with the new foreign minister of Ukraine, who was also there. That failed when the Russians refused.
We agreed to continue intense discussions in the coming days with Russia, with the Ukrainians, in order to see how we can help normalize the situation, stabilize it, and overcome the crisis.
There was some forward movement on the diplomatic front, though. The European Union has agreed to underwrite a loan of about $15 billion to Ukraine over the next 2 years. There was an agreement to set up an observer force in Crimea. About 40 people from 21 different countries, including at least one Canadian. They will be on the ground in Crimea almost immediately to keep an eye on what's happening there. Meanwhile, Washington and Europe are preparing possible sanctions against Russia to up the pressure, and Russia, in return, is preparing possible sanctions against the West. Amid this, in Kyiv today, the interim Prime Minister, Arseniy Yatsenuk, warned that Ukraine is not willing to abandon Crimea.
We cannot figure out the reason why Russian boots are on Ukrainian ground. And it's crystal clear that it was ordered personally by President Putin. We will do our best in order to regain control over Ukrainian territory.
The situation, he says, is not just a threat to Crimea, but to the whole world. Well, tomorrow, NATO meets with the Russians in Brussels, where military options will be discussed. But barring a provocation from Ukraine, those options are becoming increasingly remote. This situation seems to be going from crisis to standoff. Donna?
All right, Tom Clark in Kiev for us tonight. Thank you, Tom.